Good to see you all. Good evening. Waving at y'all. Can see you all. Welcome. Welcome on this warm winter night. First, let me apologize for the fact that we had to postpone last week, but technology got the better of us, and so we just couldn't get it pulled together. So we're just essentially 1 week behind, but don't worry, we will catch up, and we'll catch up fast. So before we start, going to welcome my partner in crime, depending on where your screen is, Canon Augusta. Everybody, Canon Augusta. Except this time, she's actually down the hall from me. She's not in a separate building this time. So we're close by. So if things really go bad, one of us can take over. Or if you don't like me, you can have her do it, and then vice versa. So before we begin, let me offer a prayer. What I basically did is I went through the contemporary collects, and I just kind of moved my fingers for a couple of pages. And where it landed was for education, was the collect for education. So I thought, how appropriate. So we'll offer that. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty God, the fountain of all wisdom, enlighten by your Holy Spirit those who teach and those who learn, that rejoicing in the knowledge of your truth, they may worship you and serve you from generation to generation. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. So I'm going to give you all a warning, and that is that Augusta and I are history geeks, and we could talk about this literally for hours. So just know this is what we really love and enjoy. So here's our promise to you. We are going to cram 2,000 years of history in 90 minutes. At least we're going to do the best we can. I want to say you're going to get a syllabus for this, but I want to point out to you two books that are going to be on there. It's The History of Christianity by Justo Gonzalez. There's 2 volumes. If you really like history and you really like to read history that is really page turning, this is fantastic. It's not like reading a textbook. It's literally like reading a fiction book. And these are fantastic. So The Story of Christianity. I give you this a heads up because I think if you're really interested, these are 2 books to really invest in. So we'll include that, but I have a love for history, always have. And so we're going to try to go deep. We know that there's a lot of highlights and lots of things to cover in these 2,000 years, but we're going to kind of go a little deeper in places that we think is more critical, kind of try to, if you will, pull back the curtain on the sterilized, dominant version of history, and kind of go into some places where people of faith and the institution got the mission wrong and even did terrible things. We're going to kind of cover it all. So a few weeks ago, we covered the development of the New Testament, that period after the death of Jesus and the emergence of records of Jesus' story and the shepherding of the early Christian communities and the spread of the gospel. So to recap, you're with us approximately 20 years after the death of Jesus, we get the first records, which were Paul's letters. And then probably 10 years after Paul starts writing his letters, we get the first gospel, Mark. So we're going to kind of start with the early apostolic church, the 75 to 150. So what's going on in the church at that point? This is the period of the early church after the death of the last original apostle, the last original of the 12 disciples. And as original apostles died, second and third generations of leaders emerged, many of whom were students and disciples of apostles. And so by their leadership and teaching, each of them writing several letters and copies of the original that exist, guided the church in those early stages as it wrestled to learn how to be community, to understand the nature of the triune God, understand salvation and mission. So 3 church leaders that stood out then and have continued to be held up for their teaching and writing, Clement of Rome, who was either the second or third bishop of Rome, between 88 and 99 Common Era, wrote a letter to the church in Corinth. And the letter dealt with the state of ordained ministry and affirmed the authority, the apostolic authority of presbyters. The tradition ordained by Peter. You had Ignatius of Antioch, about 1110 to 140, although there is question as to when he actually died. Bishop of Antioch, wrote 7 letters to churches, mentions Polycarp in his letter to the Ephesians. And the tradition is that he was a student of John. And then you have Polycarp, 65 to 155 Common Era, Bishop of Smyrna, modern day Turkey, basically. And he wrote a letter to the church in Philippi and mentioned Ignatius. Tradition is that he too was a student of John. But we get this document, this religious text, the Didache, which if you've done any studying, you've probably heard. It's also been referred to, it's also known as the Lord's teaching through the 12 apostles to the nations. It was written sometime at the end of the 1st century, discovered by a Greek Orthodox bishop inside a monastery in modern Turkey around 1873. Original and subsequent early copies lost, but modern scholars knew about it because it was talked about by church fathers. And there can also be seen many similarities to the epistles of both Polycarp and Ignatius of Antioch. And then a complete Greek copy, as I said, was found in 1873, written sometime around 1056. It's the oldest written catechism, and it has 3 main sections dealing with Christian ethics, rituals such as baptism and Eucharist, and church organization. And it provides direction on the public worship in the church and furnishes to its reader like sort of clear examples of how certain ceremonial activities are to be handled. These notable leaders that we mentioned helped shape the early church, not only through their preaching and pastoral care, but also as the church grew. And additional conflicts and schools of thoughts emerged, which you will learn throughout our entire history in the church has been conflicts and about different schools of thought. So it's helpful to know that the first recorded church council happened sometime around 50 Common Era, called the Council of Jerusalem. It's recorded in Acts of the Apostles, dealt with the question of observance of biblical law in the early Christian community, which included the whole issue of converts, Gentile converts, which is mentioned in Acts 15. So for the next 275 years, there were approximately 15 pre-ecumenical councils or local gatherings, basically confronting a number of different issues, including customs surrounding the celebration of Easter. So at that same time, what's happening in the world? The general persecution of Christians under Nero, 54 to 68 Common Era, the Great Fire of Rome, which Nero blamed the Christians, by the way, fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple in 70 Common Era, and then basically for the next 250 years, there was state-directed persecution of Christians. And so as the Roman expansion of the empire went northward, and the conquest of Britain was a gradual process, beginning under Emperor Claudius and being largely completed by 87 with the establishment of a fort in the northern region. The Roman presence remained there for 2 centuries, and the Hadrian's Wall, it's also known as the Roman Wall, was built in 122 Common Era. It was a defensive, and if you Google it, you can see it. It's a defensive fortification of the Roman province of Britannia. Much of it, which actually still exists, and you'll see the line, if you look it up, you can see early map and drawing of it, how it divides. And so there's early reason to believe that among the Roman soldiers and accompanying servants and slaves, there would be Christians. And so the first archaeological evidence and credible record showing a community in Britain large enough to maintain churches and bishops dates to the 3rd and 4th centuries. So between the 200s to 300s. We know that there was a British delegation to the 353 Council of Rimini. Now, at Rimini in Italy, not the one in South Carolina, which is southeast of Columbia, if you Google it. There is a Rimini in South Carolina. And And they had to beg essentially for financial assistance in order to return back home. So there's a lot. So now we're going to kind of shift a bit because it's going to get a little more meaty here as we go. We kind of go to what's called the Middle Antiquity, the later Apostolic Age between 150 and 376. So again, remember, we talked about there is this spread of the Christian faith through the Roman Empire. There's a growing emergence of prominent episcopal sees, essentially areas where bishops have oversight, that were the centers of authority. Rome, Antioch, Constantinople, Alexandria, names that are probably familiar to many of you. And so from middle of the 2nd century, and for the next 200 years, there are so many men, and yes, even some women, who reflected on the traditions and stories, and then significantly expanded on the theology of the church. So these early scholars and bishops and theologians are identified, and we know them as Greek fathers and mothers. And the reason is because they lived in the eastern region of the empire. And they delved into the doctrinal specifics of salvation, Trinity, nature of God, etc. So we're not going to go into the detail of all these folks, but simply list a couple of names for you, and you can study on your own. Names that you might know. First, Clement of Alexandria, was between 150 and 215. Athanasius was after that time too, Bishop of Alexandria. But the ones that probably people know the most about is the Cappadocians, a 4th century monastic family. You've heard of Basil the Great, the Bishop of Caesarea. Then he had Gregory of Nyssa, a brother, his younger brother. There were 10 in this family. And essentially you had, as Canon Augusta likes to joke, you got 3 brothers, a sister, and a bestie who were part of this group. So Basil the Great, Bishop of Caesarea, a younger brother, Gregory of Nyssa, Bishop of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, who became the Patriarch of Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul. He's the bestie. He was the family friend. And then you have Peter of Sebaste, which was between 340 and 390, and he was the Bishop of Sebaste. He was the youngest of these 10 children. And then you had the sister, Abbess Macrina, the younger is her title, because her grandmother was known as Macrina the Elder. And she was between 324 and 379. So Basil, Nyssa, Nazianzus, Sebaste, and Macrina. Now, Macrina is said that she had tremendous influence on religious training, especially of her brother Peter. And so she provided a central place for her brothers and their friend to study and meditate, and also to provide peaceful shelter for their mother. She was really instrumental, integral. And the Cappadocians promoted early Christian theology and are actually highly respected both in Western and Eastern churches as saints. You have John Chrysostom, Archbishop of Constantinople at that same time. So you start having these ecumenical councils beginning toward the end of the late Apostolic Age with the 1st and 325 Common Era. And you've heard us talk about this before. That was the Council of Nicaea. And there were several others over the next 400 years, ending in 787 Common Era. Now, all these ecumenical councils were initiated by either the emperor or the pope. And they were gatherings of all bishops and their assisting theologians from all the Christian churches known in the world to basically determine issues of doctrine, administration, or application, and sort of reach orthodox consensus, specifically around the areas of the nature of Christ, salvation, and ecclesiology. So just before the first ecumenical council, so just before 325, we have Constantine the Great, the conversion that you've probably read about in 312, and the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity legal in 313. So 313, now the First Council of Nicaea in 325, gathered to determine the divinity of Son and the relationship to Father. I could jokingly say it was the first attempt to build consensus in the church, and we are still trying to do that to this very day. And it was said that over 1,800 bishops, I can't imagine that many bishops in one place, of the Christian church within the Roman empires were invited, which I believe then set the foundation for what we know as the Episcopal General Convention. Maybe not that big, but nonetheless big. And so it's recorded, various writings say that it was probably about 270 attended. And you want to read some interesting stuff, talk about fights and contention, it was a doozy. And so if you think that conflict in the church is a relative new thing, go back and read. You want to read about serious fighting, go back to the Council of Nicaea. So at that time, what you need to know, what's kind of happening in the empire and the greater world, is there's this growing internal civil war. You've got these competing regions of the empire and absolute political instability. So that's kind of your backdrop to all that was going on there as Christianity was legal and you had this first council. So now we start to move into that middle antiquity. And what many people know that time period, 376 to 476, is the decline of the old Roman Empire. So what's going on in the church? So during that period, we still have ecumenical councils that are continuing. And they continue, and they continue, and they continue. You see where I'm going with this. And so at that point, during that particular time, you've got some very notable folks. We mentioned earlier some weeks ago about Jerome and the Vulgate Bible in Latin. That was around this time. St. Augustine of Hippo, who was between 354 and 430. He was a theologian and the Bishop of Hippo in North Africa. And so if you've read it, and I suggest you pick it up, when Rome fell in 395 and the faith of many Christians were shaken, that's when St. Augustine wrote The City of God. Again, another well-known writing that's worth going back and looking at. And at that same time, the 420s to the 490, you had Patrick of Ireland, St. Patrick, the stuff of legend. And some of the writings of the 5th century points to the presence of Christians in Ireland. So that's kind of what's happening in the church during 376, 476. So what's happening in the world and the empire at that point? Well, 50 years after the Council of Nicaea, the Goths begin to invade into northern Italy, the region of that part of the empire, and they're fleeing the Huns. You have Emperor Theodosis I. He dies, and that's considered the date. His death is considered the date for the fall of Rome. So for 100 years, other nomadic people from Eastern Europe, Central Asia invaded West. Empire gets divided and overpowered. So in 476, did I say 14? I am already skipping into the 15th century. So in 476, 5th century, the last emperor is defeated, and the Roman Senate sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople. Man, we went through those first 500. So I'm going to take a break from talking. Augusta's going to pick up with late antiquity.
All right. So late antiquity is also known in kind of jargon language as the Dark Ages. And it really is that time when the glory of Rome and the Roman Empire no longer exists. It's also this early medieval age. So we're going to cover the next 500 years. So again, the empire is now a scattered assortment of kingdoms throughout Western Europe, which is where our story really focuses on the spread of Christianity. So the Pope, or the bishop, because Pope means father, right? Papa in Latin and Italian. So the father, or the Bishop of Rome, is trying to oversee those Christians. And you have the Byzantine Empire, the eastern side of what had been a part of the larger Roman Empire, is flourishing, and there's a lot more stability. So you just kind of keep your mind on the sense of stability over in the east, in Turkey, Constantinople, and then further east. But Western Europe is a mess. There are some really notable people for our story that is helpful for me to bring to you. You've already mentioned Benedict of Nursia, the father of Benedictine monasticism. We talked about that when we were talking about liturgy. Benedict of Nursia was born somewhere around 480 Common Era and lived until about 547. So that's happening down in Italy. I'm going to invite you to shift your gaze all the way up and kind of imagine Ireland. Remember, we talked about Patrick. There was a monk by the name of Columba, and Columba lived about 521 to 597. Legend has he was born in Ireland, and he became a monk at a really young age, and he studied theology and he studied Latin. He's thought to have established several different monasteries in Ireland. At some point, a fight broke out between him and some of these other monastic leaders over an ancient copy of the Book of Psalms. Of all things they would fight about. And so the elders of the church in Ireland at the time, which might have been bishops and heads of monasteries, basically as a way of fixing the conflict because somebody died, they said, Columba, we need you to leave. We need you just to get out of Ireland. So he did. And he got into a boat with some of his monks, and they sailed across and landed in Scotland, and they were given refuge on the island of Iona. And he establishes a monastery on the island of Iona, and from there, he teaches his monks to be evangelists and missionaries. And so from this teeny tiny little island all the way up in Scotland, all of his missionaries go south down to England, Britain, and they actually also cross the English Channel, and many of them go into northern Gaul or France and Germany. So Columba's understanding of Celtic Christianity with a Celtic ethos is really important to know that that's happening up there on that island, but that influence is going down all the way to the mainland of Western Europe. About the same time, between 540 and 604, there's a man by the name of Gregory, and he eventually became Bishop of Rome, and he's known as Pope Gregory I. He's the Pope Gregory the Great. Gregory, there's a kind of a whimsical story of Gregory walking through the streets of Rome and coming across the slave market and asking someone in his entourage, who are those fair looking young people? And he said they kind of look like angels. And someone said, well, they're from Anglia, or they're from Britain. And it kind of got Gregory thinking, what's happening up there in that kind of northern region of the old empire, not knowing anything about Columba or any of the Irish monasteries or anything happening up there. So Gregory the Great takes a man by the name of Augustine, not Augustine of Hippo, but Augustine, who was a Benedictine monk living in Italy. And he says to Augustine, Augustine, I want you to go north. I want you to go up to that land up there and to find out if there's any Christians. And Augustine starts out with a group of people and he gets scared and he turns around and he comes back. And Gregory the Great says, nope, got to go. So Augustine and his group of monks and others travel and they land on the shores of southern England, Britain. And St. Augustine encounters one of the local kings of the area, and they are given refuge, and he discovers that the king's wife is a Christian. And this region is where Canterbury is. So this is St. Augustine of Canterbury, and he becomes known as the first archbishop. And he is given prominence by Gregory to reestablish the Roman-esque ethos of the Christian tradition in this region. There's no cathedral at this point, but what Augustine does establish is a very well-known monastery called, it was the Abbey in Canterbury. I'm going to jump a little bit until 664, and there's an event called the Synod of Whitby. So remember I talked about Columba up north, and then you have Augustine coming in from Rome. So there eventually is this clash over kind of the tone and the ethos of Christianity in this part of Britain, kind of throughout the British Isles. And the question was, when do you celebrate Easter? And the king of Northumbria was very confused because the Celtic Christians, kind of along the lines of Columba's missionaries, celebrated it on one day, one Sunday. And then maybe a week later or 2 weeks later, the Roman Christians celebrated on a completely different Sunday. And it was very confusing to everyone. When is the right Sunday? So a council was gathered at the Abbey of Whitby, and a woman by the name of Hilda was the abbess. And so she created the space for this conversation. And the king and Hilda determined that they were going to follow the Roman calendar for Easter, which started to give a little bit more precedence to this Benedictine influence in that region of Christianity. It's interesting to note that St. Augustine of Canterbury lands in Canterbury on 597, the year 597 Common Era. And that's the same year that Columba dies. So there's these interesting crossovers. Just a kind of interesting note that all of Britannia is being ruled by different kings in different sections of this very small island. And they are Anglo-Saxon. And most of those kings appoint an Anglo-Saxon Archbishop of Canterbury, off and on for the next 500 years. So there's this interesting blend of Roman Benedictine monasticism and Celtic traditions that are kind of intermixing, even though the Synod of Whitby made a determination of when Easter was. If you have a moment and you want to learn more, there's two Archbishops of Canterbury that were really well known for both their writing, their spirituality. They're Cuthbert in the 8th century, in the 700s, and then Dunstan, who was in the 900s, in the 10th century. Just want to step back for a minute. Remember I told you Byzantine Empire was flourishing. Don't forget that in the 7th century, in the around 622 to 632, was the time when the Prophet Muhammad was rising in prominence. And so that is happening, and it's going to come back up in just a minute when I talk about the next millennium, beginning in the 11th century. So it's always helpful to remember that for the first 400 years of this new religion called Islam, that it was not manned, and as they also expanded in their region of Saudi Arabia, and then north, and then started kind of moving into northern Africa and into the Holy Land, it was not required that Jews or Christians had to convert. So for the first 400 years, all of these different religions more or less lived in a little bit of peace. The fighting might have been over land or other issues of conflict, but not the same issues that we then start seeing later, or this myth that Islam was all about trying to so forcefully convert Christians and Jews. About the 9th century, so this would be about the 800s, kind of skipping up a little bit here, we begin to see the rise of feudalism. Do you remember in your middle school and high school studies about feudalism and this idea of who owns land, and fealty and loyalty begins to emerge? Just some other notable components of what's happening in Western Europe. You remember King Charlemagne, who ruled France for during the 8th century. There were other ruling families, but they were not united. They kind of all oversaw their own little areas. And again, bishops, and particularly the bishop in Rome, really was just the bishop of that area. There wasn't as much influence at this point yet over all of Western Europe in the same way that we see it now in terms of the Roman Catholic Church. So those are just some of those bits and pieces. All right, now we're going to enter into the next millennia. So what's happening in the world? Beginning, remember, so Dark Ages, late Antiquity. So beginning around the start of the 11th century, this is the 1000s, if you will, there were 3 significant people or events. The first is the emergence of Pope Gregory VII, who kind of took a look at the state of the church and began to initiate some reforms. And it's known as the Gregorian Reforms. And it's under his leadership of reforming piety, liturgical practices, that the emergence of the power and authority and yes, respect of the Bishop of Rome began to take primacy over other bishops. It was also the time when the Bishop of Rome starts to get involved in affairs of state. So now you start to see this co-mingling emergence of power. So that's the first thing that's starting to happen. There's also this conflict between the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Constantinople. Remember, there hadn't been a lot of authority in Western Europe, but there was a lot of authority over with the Bishop of Constantinople and overseeing kind of the Byzantine Empire. So these 2 patriarchs kind of come to blows over who has more authority and more power. And what we end up having in 1054 is what is called the Great Schism, the Great East-West Schism. And there's this real big split between the beginnings of 2 very different church traditions, who has authority over whom. And this is the beginning of when you see the doctrine of papal supremacy. What is also happening at about the same time are the Crusades. So the Crusades were a series of religious wars that were initiated and supported and sometimes even directed by the Western Roman Church in this medieval period. So just a real quick history about why the first happened. Remember, I mentioned Muhammad. There was this kind of commingling of Muslims in the Holy Land and the Christian Byzantine Empire. But within the Muslim tradition, within Islam, there were two warring factions, and we hear it today, Sunni and Shiite. And it was almost like siblings early on, splitting, early descendants of Muhammad himself, who said, we're purer than you. No, we're purer than you. Eventually, one of those factions kind of starts to take over the holy city of Jerusalem. And there's this conflict over pilgrims. Remember, I mentioned Pope Gregory and his Gregorian Reforms. One of the things that became really, really popular, even more so than it had in the past, it happened in the past, but now it's really popular, are pilgrimages to Jerusalem. To go from wherever you were and travel to Jerusalem for a season of penance, for a time of reflection. But all of a sudden, those routes to go to Jerusalem were getting harder and harder. It was not as quite as safe. And then these conflicts started breaking out because of the conflicts between Sunnis and Shiites and how everybody else got wrapped up into those conflicts. And so the Byzantine emperor in 1098 reaches out to Pope Urban II. So even though they're still kind of on talking terms, the Byzantine emperor reaches out to the Pope and says, we need help. Can you kind of get an army together and come help defend us? And so that's the beginning of these crusades. There were several crusades for about 200 years, starting in 1096, 1098, going all the way until the 13th century, about 1271. The Crusades were seen by some as this spiritual quest. It was a way of protecting Christianity, but it also began to really shift our understanding of these other religious communities. And it was horrific. And it's one of the things that we're still having to wrestle with, that part of our Christian history. The 500 years beginning in 1000 to 1500 also begins to see, I mentioned it beginning with Gregory the Seventh, Gregory, who started the Gregorian Reforms, this deep codependence between church and state. If you went on a crusade, you could buy your way into heaven. It was one of the ways that bishops and the Pope could say to kings that were now starting to emerge in different parts of Western Europe, if you help me build my basilica in Rome, you can get your way into heaven. And the church then starts with that money buying land. And by the beginning of the 16th century, the church is one of the wealthiest landowners in Western Europe. All right. For our purposes, I want to quickly highlight a couple of people in this period that I just mentioned. 1066, does that date ring a bell for anyone? 1066 and all of that. William the Conqueror of Normandy invades Britain and claims it as his own. William the Conqueror, when he was a younger person, before he did this venture across the British Channel, there was a monastery in Bec. Bec is a small town in France, and it was Benedictine. So William the Conqueror comes in and he brings his head of the monastic house in Bec to become Archbishop of Canterbury. So he installs his own Archbishop of Canterbury, and his name was Lanfranc. Lanfranc is then followed by Saint Anselm of Canterbury, and they had some squabbles with William the Conqueror and his folks. Subsequent errors around the authority of church and state. Who has authority over people? And so you begin to see some of this tension. And then another Archbishop of Canterbury that's worth noting during this 500 years is in the 12th century. The years are 1120 to 1170. And the Archbishop's name is Thomas Becket. And if you remember Shakespeare, who will rid me of this meddlesome priest? And some soldiers of King Henry II decide to take him at his word. See, words have importance, right? And they literally went into Canterbury Cathedral and murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury. And that is what started pilgrimages from London to Canterbury and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, because stories and legends emerged over the holiness of Becket. And if you could get to the place where he was killed or get to his shrine, you would be healed. So these pilgrimages. Another person to know, we've talked about her in the past, really invite you to get to know her better, is Julian of Norwich. She was an anchorite, which means she was kind of a little bit of she was a monastic nun, but she didn't live in an abbey. She lived on her own in a cave, really. She lived beginning in the 1343 to 1416. So in the middle of the 14th century into the early part of the 15th century. One of the things that Julian was known for was her wise counsel to kings and princes. She was also alive during the time of the Black Death. And so the bubonic plague begins in Afro-Eurasia, kind of Iran, that area, and begins to make its way west very quickly, beginning in 1346. And it peaks in Europe in 1353. So Julian of Norwich is a little girl when this is happening, and her part of England is really living with the last few years of the Black Death. And her writing and her wisdom was helping people cope with this incredible pandemic that had come through and wiped out millions and millions and millions and millions of people. At the close of Julian's life in 1440, so about 30 years after her death, in 1440, we get the first printing press. And about the time that Julian is about to die, Prince Henry of Portugal sponsors one of the first explorations out of Portugal and begins to seize parts of North Africa. And all of a sudden you're going to see in this 15th century, the end of the Black Death and these notable saints, and what's going to take off in the 16th century with so much rapid change. And now I'm going to hand it back over to the bishop. And do you want to take a break?
Yeah, let's do that, because I want to give you 5 minutes or so, because I'm going to revisit the Black Death for a little, not to dwell on the negative.
That's so morbid.
But it does lead actually to And there is a lot of thought as to the experience of it and what may have led to the Renaissance. So let's take 5, and then we'll pick up with Black Death. So the reason I want to talk a little bit more about the Black Death, that's an interesting sort of soundbite right there, isn't it? Several reasons. I mean, to be honest with you, this conversation tonight about history, given living in a pandemic, this sort of took on a whole different sort of part for me. Normally, I probably wouldn't have spent much time sort of focusing on this, but I had to kind of go back a little bit because I've shared with some people that I'm the second bishop in the diocese to have been the bishop during a pandemic. You know, our first bishop of the diocese was bishop during the Spanish flu. And I often wonder what that must have been like for him and kinds of decisions. And so I've become a little bit more sort of aware of this type of situation and what life must have been under sort of circumstances. So it's interesting because when you look at the Black Death, it was the second disaster that affected Europe during the late Middle Ages. The first one that was the Great Famine that you may have heard about. And so what's fascinating is that, and you put this in the context, it is said that up to 60% of Europe's population was killed during the Black Death. And they estimate that the plague may have reduced the population from about 475 million to literally about 350 million in the 14th century. That's a pretty significant. And why I share that, because there are people who have written that some of the impacts, especially in Italy, one of the thoughts that's advanced is that huge, humongous impact of the Black Plague really resulted in essentially a shifting of a worldview or a perspective in 14th century Italy that led to the Renaissance, because Italy was particularly hit hard during the pandemic. And there are people who have said that this sort of constant dealing with death kind of caused people to reflect a little bit more about their current lives now, and a little bit less on, you know, sort of the afterlife. And it's also been said that many believe that the impact of it sort of sparked a whole new interest or call or movement, if you will, to piety, a new way of being, and that so much religious art that sort of came to be around that time. Because you have to understand that prior to the Black Death, Europe was run by the Catholic Church. And it was basically a feudalistic society. And so one of the things that's advanced is that pandemic essentially restructured the political, religious forces of the time, and that people who survived it essentially started to turn in other directions, other forms of spirituality. And so you had this sort of falling, if you will, or this complete sort of collapse of the power dynamics of these city-states. So it's an important thing to understand, because where we get led into here is the Renaissance, the age of discovery. And so that's why I took a little more time with the Black Death, just because it seems to have been a major force in this shift. And so the Renaissance, starting in 1490, and what you have is essentially over the next 300 years or so, you had the Western world experience sort of this convergence of all these interconnected movements. And so the end of European feudalism, as I talked about, this shifting away, because that was the predominant. from Middle Ages to modernity. You had this change in art and literature, thought. And so again, when you see so much religious works of art, that as a result that came to be, and so a whole new way of thinking. And so that essentially then that European age of discovery led to colonization, and essentially subjugation of people and land. They needed trade routes to Asia. It was dangerous to go through the Holy Land, so everybody was going out and looking for routes by the sea. So during that time, and I spent a lot of time studying. Again, you're going to start to wonder, I've spent time talking about plagues and I've spent time on the Spanish Inquisition. But the Spanish Inquisition, I spent some considerable time in Spain, and studied it a bit closely. And so it was established originally in 78, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And it was essentially, it was intended to maintain the Catholic orthodoxy. It was to make sure that Catholic orthodoxy was in their kingdoms, and to replace the medieval Inquisition, which was a papal control issue. And so the Spanish Inquisition actually became the more substantive of the three different manifestations you've seen of it, that were part of what's referred to as the larger Catholic Inquisition. There was a Roman Inquisition as well, and the Portuguese Inquisition. And so essentially the Spanish Inquisition, the reason why that's such a focus is because it not only was in Spain, but in all Spanish colonies and territories, all Spanish possessions, North, Central, South America. And it is estimated that around 150,000 were persecuted for a variety of offenses during that whole duration, essentially 3-century duration. And you had anywhere from between 3,000 and 5,000 were executed. So it was originally intended primarily to identify heretics among those who converted from Judaism and Islam to Catholicism. And then you had these royal decrees that came in, I think, 1492 and then 15 something. I apologize, I don't know off the top of my head, that ordered Muslims and Jews to convert to Catholicism or leave. So, there's a real darkness here that went on, and I don't think people really recognize it was not definitively abolished until 1834. It took until the reign of Queen Isabella II for that to change. And I spent a lot of time in Spain, as I said, in El Escorial, which is a old palace. And when I was there, one of the people who was touring, because that's where all the monarchs of Spain are buried, but one of the people there said, "Can't you just hear the ghosts of the Inquisition haunt these hallways?" In the midst of this beauty and this grand palace, and where all the monarchs up to present day are buried, here's this person telling me, "Can't you just hear the ghosts of the Inquisition in these hallways?" So it's a significant part of understanding, because as you start to understand Reformation and these movements, it's important to understand sort of these significant. So in 1493, you still got Queen Isabella, King Ferdinand. There is a papal bull issued by Alexander VI, and the Inter Caetera, and it's basically said that any land that's not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed and exploited, and declared that the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread. This is the exact quote: that the health of souls be cared for, and that the barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to faith itself. Your sort of typical bishop letter. Pretty harsh, But essentially, I mean, it's essentially saying King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella, go for it, get the land. It is your right. And so you can exploit it, do what it needs to in terms for the Catholic faith. And so around that time, you've got the Spanish sponsor, a little known Italian, Columbus, and starts to make the first of these 3 trips in 1492. And so for the rest of that 16th century, people are going everywhere. They're discovering things that are new to them, new lands, and different routes to Asia. And let's be honest, doing a lot of horrible, terrible things along the way. Now, I'm not trying to just skirt that and not go into it, but we can study a lot, but we all know sort of that particular age of some of the things. But meanwhile, to kind of come back to the direction I want us to go to, you had the Protestant Reformation in 1522. So you're essentially setting the conditions right for this struggle with papal supremacy, the Catholic Church, its influence. And so the Protestant Reformation was a rebuke of church practices. That sort of toxic codependency between church and state. And actually a new learning by clergy who claimed local authority to refine theology, to practice. And so now we get a very important character, King Henry VIII. And so King Henry VIII alone, I think, could be a 5-part class in itself. And there's wonderful books, and we'll give some of them to you to kind of dive in deeper, because I think it's a little too easy and convenient to say, and I've heard Episcopalians say it, Henry VIII couldn't get a divorce, so we're here now. Because he had an issue and he couldn't get a divorce, we exist. It's a bit more complicated than that. And what you have to understand is that, so when you think back, King Henry's brother died. And so his brother was the one that was being groomed and prepared to be king. Many people don't understand is that Henry VIII was actually preparing for a life in the church. And so when people read things and he writes things about the church or theology, it's not that he's some kind of a hack or an amateur. He was being groomed to be a pope of the to be a bishop of the church, to be someone of significance. So he had theological understanding, but because of the death of his brother, he was then the next in line for the throne. And so there was a dispensation for him to marry Catherine of Aragon. And so he had one daughter, no sons, and Henry thought he was cursed. And there's been all sorts of versions, fictionalized, and did anybody by curiosity see the series? I happen to like, although some historical aspects of it were a little. Anybody see the series The Tudors? It was an excellent series that I went, I don't know, for several years on King Henry VIII. It made him a lot more handsome than supposedly he was, but I guess that's Hollywood. They didn't talk about his open boils and the things that he had festering on his leg, but that's for another day. So here's where we get to this issue where people say this is essentially how we came to be, and that's all it was about, was divorce. So he falls in love with Anne Boleyn. He requests another dispensation for annulment from the Pope. Pope said no. Now here's an important thing to understand. So the Pope said no, and why? Because he was under pressure from Charles V. Now, who was Charles V? He was not only the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Spain, but he was the nephew of the Queen, married to Henry VIII. So Charles V was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. So I wonder why Charles V put pressure on the Pope to say no. So ultimately what it came down to, and this is the bigger picture, it wasn't about whether I could get a divorce or not. It was ultimately about, like a lot of things in the church, who has authority. It was about who's in charge. who has the sovereignty and who has the reign. So this legal battle that is well documented about who can issue an annulment is the beginning of what ultimately comes about who has the authority over the church in England. And King Henry was very clear that I am the sovereign. I have the final say, not the man with a pointy hat in Rome. And so while, yes, it began about this battle of the annulment, and you can certainly read the accounts as to what he was advancing, as to why he deserved the annulment. The bottom line is it was a much larger issue about authority. That's what it comes down to. And again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but not the first time throughout the history and to today that issues in the church or others come over who has authority. So essentially, through a series of legislative acts, the church in England becomes an independent ecclesiastical body. Its own set of canons. People who lived under the reign and in the sovereign nation of King Henry, anybody who appealed to any other power outside that realm for resolution on any issue could be tried. This was establishing King Henry is the sovereign of all, including the church. And so less money goes to Rome. They eventually abolish any tithe. Then you have the Act of Succession that named Henry's heirs from Anne. To disagree again would be treason. Henry then becomes the head of the church. So at this point, now we start to see the emergence of a character and someone we know well and we've heard about, which is Thomas Cranmer. So King Henry VIII appoints Thomas Cranmer to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. Why? Primarily so that he could have Cranmer declare the marriage of Henry and Catherine null and void, and essentially hold up the fact that Henry and Anne Boleyn is legal. But here's a very important thing, and this is the part that I think people gloss over. Remember what I said about Henry VIII's training. He was being trained for a life in the church. He studied theology, and if you read what he wrote, it's pretty amazing, the stuff that he knew, and he could take anybody to task on issues of theology and doctrine. So what's important to understand is it's not like a switch was turned and what we know today is what we were. All the theology, all the doctrine, the practice in England, and the church in England stayed the same. It's not like they became all of a sudden Anglicans in the Episcopal Church we know today. The theology and the doctrine and the practice and the liturgy stayed the same. And so it was during that time, if you remember, we mentioned that if you look in our prayer book, the Great Litany that's still there, that's during that time when Cranmer wrote the Great Litany. And then he translated the Psalter. And so if you remember your history, sort of this sense of dissolving all monasteries, getting rid of them, seizing lands, seizing money, and essentially saying that the loyalty was to him. And so remember, though, at this time too, that monasteries were the second wealthiest landowners, and their allegiance was to the Pope. So you had this movement of Henry VIII was dissolving, and in some of the versions, like if you watch the Tudors, it seems like Anne Boleyn was pretty much behind it all. But it's not like he needed a lot of motivation because he was very clear about that he was sovereign. So that's where you have, and there are arguments as to who was possibly in his ear, who were the influences to push him in a more departed way. If you know, he resisted a lot of the Protestant pushes that were happening. Many whisper that Anne was kind of, and others around her, including her father and others that were close, were trying to push him more into a Protestant Reformation. But his issue was authority. His issue is who your allegiance was. So Henry dies, and so his son, Edward I, who, let's be honest, was a boy king who was manipulated by handlers. And so during that time, he was between 1547, 1553. Cranmer writes the first prayer book in 1549, and it's revised in 1552. Very, very key parts in our development, and actually also 39 articles, which is a very foundational part of who we are as Anglicans. It essentially codified the Anglican beliefs. It takes on the Catholic beliefs and codifies this new way of thinking. And this is the area, this is where people know, this is where clergy can marry. This is the beginning of where clergy are allowed to marry, is in those 39 articles. Also very important as apostolic succession. This understanding that lineage from bishops back to the first apostles. And to this day, when bishops are ordained in the church, we believe that the hands that were on us, on our heads, and their hands were on other heads, it goes all the way back to the first apostles. And so that's one of the big issues in the Episcopal Church, Anglican Church, when it talks about whether we are in communion with other churches, is one of the issues has been apostolic succession. So we literally believe that, to me, they could literally trace the hands that were on me all the way back. So this primacy of continuity becomes what I just said is our standard in the Episcopal Church today, that we go back. So the irony here is then you have, he dies, and then you have Mary. And the Mary Elizabeth the First is a whole nother, it could be a soap opera on its own. Bloody Mary, who had this big shift and said, everything's going back to Rome. She remained the head of the church, but she reverted everything back to Rome. And that's when Cranmer gets martyred. That's when these others who were seen as moving away from the Catholic faith were martyred. And then Elizabeth I, Anne's daughter, with King Henry VIII, we get this amazing period of time, the Elizabethan part of the world, which the irony of King Henry VIII so desperately trying to get a male heir, that it's his daughter with Anne that he had executed, that becomes one of the greatest monarchs in all of the empire, and one of the most successful periods of Great Britain and England. And so during that time, you have this Elizabethan settlement, you have this movement. So claim St. John's, Newfoundland in 1583. Then we get these wonderful periods of the Roanoke Colony, which I'm sure many of us know here. The first attempt of the Roanoke Colony, Laney, Dare County, North Carolina. And of course, what do? They all ended up returning afterwards because there was a shortage of food. They were being attacked by the indigenous people. So then 2 years later, here comes John White, second attempt at founding the Roanoke Colony. So he goes back, and what happens, if we all know the story, he comes back 3 years later, and 120 settlers are gone, disappeared. This is what's referred to as the Lost Colony. So that was in 1590. That was during this period. So there was this movement in this direction. Then it's under James I, who comes in 1604. Elizabeth I dies in 1603. And the irony, if you've ever married Elizabeth, whoever was throwing whoever in jail at whatever particular time, they end up buried together, which is the irony here in all of it, in England at Westminster. But James I comes in 1604 to 1625. This is when you get the Jamestown settlement. Bruton Parish, the Anglican parish that's still in existence today in Williamsburg. 1619, the first recorded slaves from Africa arrived near Jamestown. And then you have in 1620, of course, the Puritan separatists that established the Plymouth colony. So English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, affected church by destruction of church windows, frescoes, the whole issue of knocking down icons. And so for the next 175 years, the Church of England in the American colonies is assisted by English clergy. No local bishops, and all vestries and clergy are under the authority of Bishop of London. So during this period then, in 1730s to the 1730s, we get the Second Great Awakening. This is that spiritual and theological movement that went and transcended Protestant denominations. It was emergence of small group prayer and study, personal salvation and conversion. That's when you had people like John and Charles Wesley, the Wesley brothers, George Whitefield. And so there was this real emphasis, this evangelical fervor, the role of the Holy Spirit, value on converting others, including slaves and indigenous, natives people. And so that led to the evangelical group in Clapham neighborhood of London to embrace abolition, which then they forced Parliament to abolish slavery in the early 1800s. So that was a tremendous time going on, that Second Great Awakening. And of course, 1776. Now, just so you know, we're going to kind of skim this because this is going to have a large influence we talk about next week when we start talking about the Episcopal Anglican structure and governance. There's a lot here, but just the highlight, essentially, 1776, the American Revolution. And so given everything that the colonies were resisting and pushing, the sense of being ruled from afar, having very little say over themselves, look at the church. So how do you preserve a hierarchical church with bishops in a society that's infused with this democratic, republican, and we use those with little r's and little d's, values? In the midst of all this colony and resistance, how do you then preserve a hierarchical church? So we move to 1783, Samuel Seaberry is elected the first bishop of Connecticut. He had to go all the way to Scotland to be consecrated. And that was a story in itself, just to get him consecrated. And if you want some really wonderful reading, read that story. So it was in 1785 when you start seeing the first ordinations on American soil. And then in 1786, revised Book of Common Prayer in 1786. Interesting stories there. I served in a parish in Virginia that had been around during the Revolution and Civil War, et cetera. And there's copies of where altar books were crossed out, where it talked about praying for the king, and other references were. And so you had clergy that were living in fear, others who went along because they knew that if they didn't have their allegiance and there wasn't a prayer for the king in their services, they would be taken away. So, I mean, it was a very interesting time while all this is happening for the church. So in 1787, to kind of fast forward, two priests, William White and Samuel Provost. I say Provost, it's not spelled like provost. So William White is elected Bishop of Pennsylvania, and Samuel Provost is elected Bishop of New York. Both of them were consecrated by the Archbishop of Canterbury and other bishops because at that point, there was this restoring of the relationship between the church here and the Church of England. Interesting side note, both of them actually served as chaplains to the US Senate during the days of troubles. And this is what's fascinating. So William White is the first and fourth presiding bishop of our church. And Samuel Provost was the third and possibly the second presiding bishop. So I'm sort of joking that just sort of say, no, you take it for the next time, and then I'll take it again, and then you take it. So they were very key. And Samuel Provost, if you're interested, you go to Trinity Church to this day, where Alexander Hamilton is buried. Samuel Provost is buried there in Trinity Church courtyard. And then William White, if you go to the cathedral in downtown Philadelphia, is literally buried under the altar and is all marked out. So my friend who's the Bishop of Pennsylvania says, I literally stand on the beginning of the Episcopal Church. So 1789, and if you look on the top of if you look at the shield of the General Convention of the Episcopal Church, it says 1789. That's when the ratification of the very first constitution and canons of the Episcopal Church, the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States of America, was the official title. And then in 1789, you had the second revision of the Book of Common Prayer. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm not going to go into 1800. I'm not going to go any further, the modern age, because essentially we'll just have a few highlights that we'll kind of pick up from there, because there's going to be some other stuff that we're going to bring in that I just mentioned that's going to deal with church polity and governance. Because these roots and some of the details that were happening during that time of the American Revolution does bear itself, especially why bishops in other parts of the Anglican Communion struggle with us bishops in the Episcopal Church, because they wonder, why can't we just say this is how it's going to be done and it's done? Because there's a difference in the authority of bishops throughout the Anglican Communion. So that's kind of stuff we're going to kind of dive into a little bit more deeply. But I want to stop there. Augusta, is there anything you want to add to what I might have just talked about?
I think next week when we talk about polity, we'll also just be able to highlight some of the things that we struggle with as Episcopal Christians in the United States, because there was a real heavy emphasis on congregationalism. So how are we Protestant and how are we hierarchical? How do we, like so many other Anglicans, how do we blend that in our how we organize ourselves as a church? So there's a long history within the Episcopal Church and the Church of England here in the United States, or the colonies at the time.
And one of the things we'll also talk a little about is when the church at General Convention consented to the election of Gene Robinson. That was an issue that not only was there the theological issue that was presenting itself, but part of the larger that took its place in the larger Anglican communion among bishops was authority. And that also came to a head in conversations with bishops around the world as to authority. And it still shows up every now and then when Anglican bishops around the world struggle and they shake their head and they look at the bishops in the Episcopal Church and say, because how we were developed with this sense of the laity and the clergy sharing this. So it's a pretty comprehensive that we'll unpack. But what Canon Augusta just said, it touches on some of these understandings of who we are, how we're organized, congregational movements, hierarchical. So anyway, that in itself is going to be another wonderful conversation, I think, too. Is there any questions? I can't open my.
I don't see any questions, but we have time for about 5 minutes if anyone has questions about 2,000 years worth of history.
We just pulled out the fire hose. They asked for water.
I just have one. What was White's first name?
William White.
William White.
Samuel Provost and William White.
Correct.
Thank you.
And Samuel Seaberry.
And Samuel Peaberry?
Seaberry.
Okay, gotcha.
If you'll notice too, we can talk about it next time. If you look at the Episcopal Shield, there's the history, because in there, not only do you have the flag of England with the red and the white, but you also have the St. Andrew's Cross of Scotland representing our roots, with Seaberry being ordained by the Scottish Church. And then the stars represent the original churches, the original dioceses in the colonies. So that shield shows our English, our Scottish heritage, as well as the beginning of how we were formed in the number of provinces or dioceses that existed early on.
Okay.
I just want to add one more thing. So tomorrow I will email everyone on the list the recording of tonight's class. I will also give you the syllabus about the books that we talked about, the resources we use to present material tonight, as well as some of the resources from 2 weeks ago when we presented about Holy Scripture and the history and other resources that would help you not only do Bible study, but also know the history of the compilation of all of the books of the Bible. So we'll add that in and I will mail that out to you all tomorrow. The link for next week's class will be the same link that you have, but I will email it to everyone next week, Monday, just to make sure that you get it. You will not get a reminder from Eventbrite because we're adding a class. It's not part of the original Eventbrite, so you're not going to get a reminder from Eventbrite, but you will get a reminder from me. All right, y'all.
Hope you enjoyed this all.
Thank you. Good night.
God bless you.